Sewing seams with ease basically means sewing a longer edge to a shorter edge to add some slight fullness and three-dimensionality to the finished seam. The concept can be a little bit confusing if you've never come across a situation where you have to add ease into a seam. Easing is not something that should be used when the two seam edges don't fit together. It is very intentional and only used along organic raised points on the body. Sewing a seam with ease entails sewing a larger fabric edge to a smaller edge such that the resulting seam creates fullness but does not leave puckers or folds like gathering would. As opposed to gathering, which is visible on the face of the garment and often incorporated into its design, easing a seam is purely functional and not necessarily visible on the face of the garment. Easing makes an invaluable difference in the fit and comfort of a garment. Easing is basically excess that is added to seams that cross over organic round shapes on the body. There are two types of seams that use easing. One requires an ease stitch and some slight gathering to fit the two seam edges together. Another uses no ease stitching. The easing is simply worked into the seam by hand using densely inserted pins. A seam that requires a large edge to be sewn to a shorter one requires the use of ease stitching. You will not be able to get the two edges to perfectly align in length unless the larger one is manipulated to become smaller. This is where ease stitching comes in. Apply a straight stitch next to the seam line of the longer edge. This is the ease stitch. It should be located within the seam allowance next to the seam line but not crossing into the right side of the garment. Leave enough loose thread at the end of the stitch so that it's easy to pull and gather it. Keep in mind that ease stitching should be used solely in the construction process and not visible on the face of the garment. Next, match the short edge to the ease-stitched long edge at the top and bottom first. Insert a pin at each end perpendicular to the edges. The length of the seam edges will not match at this point. Grab the bobbin thread on one end of the ease stitch and gently pull, spreading the fullness evenly throughout until the longer edge matches the shorter seam edge in length. Once both edges match in length, insert pins perpendicularly to keep the two edges perfectly aligned. It helps to use the blunt end of a needle or a pin to gently spread the gathers. Next, carefully machine stitch the seam with the eased layer facing up. As you stitch, be careful not to pucker or fold the gathered edge. This seam should remain smooth but have fullness. Iron the machine stitch in the direction it was applied, then finish and iron the seam allowance as specified in your project. If the seam requires a very small amount of ease, meaning the two edges are close to the same length but just slightly off, you can use pins alone to align the eased edge in place. The pins have to be applied perpendicular to the two fabric edges, or it will not hold the layers together properly. First, match the top and bottom ends of the two seam edges and insert pins perpendicularly through both fabric layers at these 2 points. Always keep the longer edge on top in the alignment and pinning process. With your fingers, work the longer edge such that its ease is evenly distributed to match the smaller edge underneath. Insert pins perpendicular to the edge, spreading the fullness evenly throughout. Each mound of fullness should be visually equal in shape from pin to pin. Next, machine stitch carefully with the longer seam edge on top. Carefully apply pressure with your fingers and readjust the fullness to achieve a smooth seam. Remove each pin as you approach it and do not sew through the pins. Once complete, iron the seam and apply the seam allowance finish of your choice. As opposed to the seam with moderate to heavy ease described earlier, this finish will be very subtle with the fullness almost invisible to the naked eye.